advertising's wrong. You shouldn't urge people to buy things. What you really want is this balance between consistency and freshness. Once you've got a formula that works and people keep using it, it will stop working. People measure and attach value to measurements, to things that are easy to measure, but they're not always the right things. The idea that you can ask questions at all is wrong. This is the not even wrong, okay?
Hello, wonderful people, and welcome to Not Even Wrong, where we're on a crusade against sloppy thinking. For those of you who are new, not even wrong is a phrase that the legendary physicist Pauli used to say when people had, ideas that were sort of so internally inconsistent, so strange that they were not even worthy of the term wrong. And so I think there's a lot of confused thinking out there about AI, about economy, about marketing, about all sorts of topics. And I try to speak with experts to try and understand what are the things that the public has a lot of misconception on. And even the practitioners of the field may have a lot of ingrained misconceptions that are worth clearing out. So the following is my conversation with a man who needs no introduction, at least in the marketing circles, Les Binet, who's now a professor officially, and he is the world's leading expert on marketing effectiveness and efficiency. He has been doing econometrics for the last 40 years, has written a number of fantastic books, and he's also an old friend. So we're going to chat about marketing, about misconceptions there, about what are the things that are not even wrong, what are the things that are clearly wrong, and then what are the things that nobody knows, because that's the fun part. Enjoy, wonderful Les Binet.
Hello.
Thank you for speaking with me.
It's always a pleasure, George.
Oh, the pleasure is completely mine. Imagine you have to actually explain how marketing works to a 5-year-old. I think that would be a good place to start.
I'm just actually thinking about my own daughter when she was about 6. She said something like, I think advertising's wrong. You shouldn't urge people to buy things, which is not a bad description in a way. One thing that we could go into in a bit is that marketing and advertising are not the same thing.
Okay.
Not all marketing is advertising. Advertising is a subset of marketing. But let's focus on advertising. I mean, it's about basically using communications to influence people's behavior, particularly what they buy. And how does it work?
Yeah, how do you make somebody change their mind about what they want to buy, or seed a new idea about something they want to buy? To
go back to the story of my daughter, because there's a sort of a little coda to that story. This came up when I was taking her to school one day, and I think she saw a poster for something, and it's like she didn't approve. And then some weeks later, we went away on a little break somewhere, and we stayed in a little bed and breakfast, and we ended up watching commercial TV, and she saw some TV ads. Now, we didn't let her watch commercial TV at home. She used to watch BBC, so she hardly ever seen TV adverts, and she absolutely loved them. And she was watching a cartoon for indigestion remedies and laughing. And I said, I thought you didn't like advertising. And she said, oh no, I love TV advertising. No, I'm talking about those other ones, in the newspapers and stuff like that. I suddenly realized actually that her hostility was towards this sort of hard sell advertising, whereas charming, funny cartoons on TV, she's absolutely fine with. And actually, I had a very similar experience with one of the mums in the school playground who told me how much she hated advertising. And then I mentioned the fact that we worked on the John Lewis advertising and the Harvey Nichols advertising, both of which she absolutely adored. And she said, no. I mean, I hate all those adverts that you get that come in through the mailbox. She meant direct mail. this is a long preamble, but there are two sort of broad ways that advertising can work. There's the stuff which is kind of like urging you to buy things with, here's 5 reasons you should buy. Pay attention. Here's 5 reasons you should buy. Fill the form in now. Click the link. Sell, sell, sell. And then on the other hand, there's the stuff where you just kind of go, hi, here's a cartoon cat. And that's much more charming and entertaining and low-key, soft sell. People get very pissed off about one a lot of the time, and quite often quite like the other. But broadly speaking, okay, so the soft sell stuff, the brand advertising, is about reminding people you exist and making people feel warm towards you, so that one day, when they need your product, they'll think of you and think fondly of you. And then the hard sell stuff is about, hey, you need to buy, a light bulb right now. And, here's our light bulbs, and they're cheaper than anyone else's, and we can get them to you in 24 hours and blah, 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 blah. Peter Field and I call that sales activation. And that is, both of these things work, but they work in quite different ways.
So the positive story that you told is quite charming, as you said, and warm and entertaining. And there is a way of explaining probably to a 5-year-old of essentially the way advertising works is you entertain people. And once you entertain them, they want more of whatever it is that you sell. By association. And you could probably tell a story about, a nice little, in the old days, guy sort of singing songs and bringing the ice cream truck, right? Yeah. Going, or Watermelon Man, or that is the story. But the song is sort of the preamble for the nice thing. And then that results ideally in a relationship where you're excited about the entertainment, and by extension, you're excited about whatever funds the entertainment in terms of the sale. And that exchange of value all of a sudden feels quite good, because you're buying something, they're making profit out of it, they invest some of that profit in your entertainment, everybody is better off as a result.
It's all about salesmanship, at least if it's commercial advertising. Obviously, there are other areas, like if you're doing government advertising to get people to stop smoking or something, that's a different thing. It's all about influencing behavior, but it's about playing the long game versus, getting immediate results. So I think really good salesmen, know how to build up relationships and charm people and schmooze people and, prepare for the sale long before the actual sale. There is a version of selling, which is, we sometimes get these guys come door to door sort of going, will you buy dusters or something? And it's some rather dodgy guy who you think, could be scoping out your house to burgle it, and you don't trust them, and you kind of like, but then there's another approach to salesmanship, which is where you build up a relationship over a long period of time. So I can think of 2 straight away. The guy who eventually got me to move my pension fund from one place to another spent 10 years
working on you,
courting me. Another really good one was my college, where I went to university, their alumni program. After I graduated, they would ring me every, couple of years. And usually it was an undergraduate. It was usually a sort of charming sounding young lady. I think they know what they're up to. Would basically ring me up, just to ask me how I was, and to talk about my career journey and what life was like out of university.
That feels
and they
good.
did this for something like 15 years and never asked me for money once. All they did was, just, how you doing, et cetera, et cetera. And also, would you like to come to a dinner at the college, reunion, et cetera, et cetera. It may even have been longer than 15 years. I can't remember, but I kept waiting for them to ask me for money, and they didn't. I suspect what they were probably doing is taking copious notes and trying to estimate my income level or something like that. But eventually, one time, the woman on the phone said, we talked for half an hour or something, and he said, I'm really embarrassed to ask this, but I'm just wondering, is it possible that you might consider making a donation? And I went, oh, at
Finally.
last, I was waiting for this, yes, of course, where do I sign? It was such an easy sell for her. And of course, I've signed up to give them regular money for the next, 25 years, What they'd done is they'd warmed up the sale. And as a result, the sale was easy. Whereas the opposite approach, the sort of the very worst kind of urging people to buy things, is where you get relentlessly hit with, intrusive messages urging you to click on the link, buy now, limited time offer, don't miss out on this, blah, 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 for something you're not even vaguely interested in. Mm-hmm. And not charming their way into your life, but demanding attention.
Does it work though? Sometimes. That's always for me the question of, yes, it's, yes, people hate it, but is there either by mere exposure effect or any other, just here's money, just get out. Does it work?
Just occasionally, you could get one of these messages at a moment when you're ready to buy. So, for example, I get regular emails from the company that I buy my trousers from. I probably get an email from them at least once a week, I think.
That's a lot of trousers.
No, well, you see things. So it's a company that makes them to measure. Most people won't know this, but I am slightly shorter than average height, and it's hard for me to get trousers that fit me. So this company have my measurements and they can send me exactly what I want. So I maybe buy trousers twice a year, and I get 52 emails a year. So to be honest, it probably doesn't really make any difference, because when it eventually comes to the point where I buy trousers, they're the only ones I ever go to, sort of. So that is pointless. It's much more likely, the sort of things that would work would be, for example, if I Google, birthday cake, and then I see then a paid search ad.
So there's an existing intent of some sort.
Exactly. Yeah. A
likelihood of.
That's the kind of stuff that, that it's clearly I've shown intent. Again, it's about targeting people at the moment when they're ready to buy. And despite all the bullshit about, digital media being incredibly tightly targeted, etc. Most of it's not, is it? For example, Amazon's are very good at, showing me ads for things I've already bought. Marks and Spencer's, I buy clothes from them, and they regularly, they have, all my personal details, and they send me adverts for women's underwear, which I don't buy from Marks and Spencer's, by the way. It's just like, my sex, I buy men's suits, Yeah, but you might be interested.
There must be some sort of a lookalike persona who has both affinities.
Anyway, so much of that stuff is just resented and intrusive. A thing that I have a particular bugbear at the moment with is notifications on the phone.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a last sort of sacred personal.
Exactly. Yeah. So.
Space.
These days, I do a lot of my reading on the phone, on the Kindle app. So, in that sort of golden hour when I'm, losing myself in a good book, I'll get a, relentless, flow at the top of the screen, just kind of near where my eyes are, order a takeaway, get a cab. And the problem is with a lot of those, I don't want to turn the notifications off because if I order a cab, I want to know if it's coming. So I allow them to have notifications. But to me, that's like while I'm relaxing, having my golden hour in the evening, someone jabbing a compass in my leg every few minutes. It's kind of like... sorry, I didn't really intend this to turn into a rant about our industry. But
no, I think that's...
There's an issue here, which is that the companies who are doing this can measure something. So they'll be doing this and they will be getting some responses. So, patisserie Valerie until I finally blocked them, used to send me an advert for cakes every single week, sometimes several times a week. I used to buy a cake from Patisserie Valerie once or twice a year. It's possible, they'll be measuring this. They're sending out these emails, and they go, yeah, well, if you look at this, we get a response rate of 1.5%. It may be, 2% maybe if they're lucky of these emails. We get a response. So that's great. And they're forgetting that what that means is they sent out 10 million emails and 98% of them have gone to people who are not interested in them. And probably that means that, they've got they pissed 9 million people off. They've got a handful of sales, they sold a handful of cakes, and 9 million people are going, I fucking hate Patisserie Valerie. And they can't measure that. They've got no measure of that.
There's also the cost question. When the cost of sending that stuff out is close to zero, then any sort of return feels like it's a positive ROI. And that's what I find quite interesting with the current transition with sort of generative media, right, of all sorts, text, images, video. If one of the major effects is you have the cost of putting shit out there going dramatically down, all of a sudden it's going to feel like the ROI is worth it, even if 99.9% of what you created was noise. Obviously, then elevated noise, then the second order reactions of people developing some sort of filters, mental or technical. But there's a moment during which when something is radically cheaper, you necessarily have the tragedy of the commons. How are you thinking about that dynamic?
Yes, as you say, it does. As it gets cheaper to do this stuff, then things get worse. So, I mean, people got annoyed by spam. This is a pre-internet problem. People used to get annoyed by the copious amounts of
they still do. I think in France, there's still like an average of, I once looked it up, like 45 kilos of paper delivered to an average house a year, and 45 kilos, like that's a young tree. Is
that 45 kilos now?
I think so. Yeah. Okay. Well, a few years ago when I looked it up.
But of course, digital stuff is more intrusive. It's like, like I said, with the notifications on the phone, we talk about people having shorter attention spans these days. I'm not sure that's true, but what they do have is many more distractions. So, if I'm trying to read a book, every few seconds, I'm having to cancel that notification, and it disrupts your flow. So there is a huge cost for people in these irritations, these distractions. And at times it can boil over into, incandescent anger. I have this problem with my telephone provider. They seem to think because they're a telephone provider, a good way to get me, of course, is to call me in person with their latest offer. And that makes me so angry. If it wasn't such a pain in the ass to change your telephone provider, and none is better than any other, at times I feel, after one of those encounters, it takes me a little time to calm down. I realize that I'm now sounding very much like a grumpy old man.
If we play this out for a second, you're basically saying there is a lot of techniques in making people more likely to buy something that by the nature of the KPIs attached to them, which are short term, and by the nature of the measurement, and by the nature of the asymmetric warfare of the cost of creating noise versus the cost of delayed cost of sort of that noise possibly creating damage. By all of those things, you get to a significant portion, and possibly still a growing portion, of the money that's being spent on marketing that is spent not only ineffectively for the business, but also creating a significant damage for the public. Is that true to say?
Absolutely. So I think there's a couple of things in there. As you say, one is about cost. Another thing is about measurement. I spent a lot of my career trying to measure the effects of marketing, which is not always straightforward. But one of the things that the whole digital revolution has done over the whole of the last 40 years, and I'm talking pre-internet actually, one thing that's happened is it's become much easier to measure certain things. Some of the effects and some of the responses from marketing have become much easier to measure. And there is this lamppost effect, but for the benefit of your listeners, old joke, policeman sees a man drunk on his hands and knees under a lamppost. And he says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm looking for my keys. I dropped my keys." So the policeman gets that down as well and has his torch, and neither of them can find the keys. He said, "Where exactly did you drop them?" And the drunk guy points over into a dark corner and said, "Over there." And he said, "Why are you looking here?" He said, "Well, the light's better." This is, people measure and attach value to measurements, to things that are easy to measure, but they're not always the right things. I think one of the most important examples of this predates the internet. And it began in the late 80s, early 90s, when electronic point of sale came in. When I first joined the advertising industry, it was very hard to measure and see the effects of price promotions. You could sort of see something if you had a kind of cut the coupon type offer. But if you just did, bog off, buy one, get one free, and you looked at the sales data, you didn't see much effect. And the reason was they didn't have high frequency sales data. When I first joined the industry, you had bi-monthly data. So you could only see, what you'd sold over the last 2 months. That was typical for supermarkets. So you'd run a buy one, get one free for a week. You come back 2 months later and look at the figures for May, June and say, very little effect. And then they moved to monthly data, and you began to see a bit more of an effect. And then they started to get electronic point of sale data where you could get daily and weekly figures and so forth. And all of a sudden you could see these sales spikes where you ran the price promotions. As a result, the volume of price promotions exploded in the late 80s, early 90s.
Because you sort of have proof.
You could prove it. But in fact, actually, the bi-monthly data was actually more true, because what happens with price promotions is a lot of the time you get a short-term spike, but then because people go, they buy it when it's on offer, and then it slightly depresses sales for the next 2 months. So the net effect is often small in volume terms, even smaller in revenue terms, or sometimes negative, and the profit effect is often sharply negative. But because people could see these short-term volume spikes, they started doing more of it. So for a lot of businesses, for a lot of brands, that resulted in being able to measure this thing meant more price promotions, which meant their profits went way down. It was probably one of the single most damaging things for brands that's happened in my career lifetime. And that really comes from measuring a thing which is not the whole story. The similar problem with performance marketing is you can measure some positive effects. By the way, not always, those positive effects are not always what they seem. So, people click on the link to buy it, but very often they're going to buy it anyway. It's just they happen to click on that link. So you get an exaggerated view of the incremental sales, and
so
you get
like
no reading at all on the deep hostility that you're creating amongst a bunch of other people.
Speaking of measurement, one of the things that's definitely happening now is that the performance marketing people are sort of getting increasingly more excited. The dream of the fully black hole or black box kind of self-optimizing spray and then pay into what works, social first, completely generative, targeted down to one, like put in whatever buzzwords you want. But that dream is sort of finally getting real-ish. You could imagine now it's going to be a pretty shitty one, but it's going to get better. A thing where you just say, here's $100, make me 150 over the next month. And a lot of the startups, or at least sort of people who sell online, they buy into this idea, because if ultimately, if as a business, I can put in $100 and get 120 back, then, that's a good thing, supposedly. However, obviously, all of these black box situations only work if you have a clear value function, if you have a clear thing to optimize for, if you then can sort of compare. What are your thoughts on the best and worst sort of metrics? And could there be, probably not a one-dimensional, but a multi-dimensional metric that would actually be a good enough proxy for not just short-term effects, but long-term effects?
I think, as I said to you the other day, I mean, when pontificating about AI, the only thing we can be certain of is that nobody really knows what's going to happen. It's all changing too fast. AI can be used in smart ways and it can be used in dumb ways. It's a kind of intelligence multiplier.
And stupidity multiplier, as Dijkstra used to say.
Well, that's exactly, I mean, as I said something similar the other day, that, clever people can use it in clever ways. And dumb people will be able to do dumb shit, 10 times
at the speed of light,
more efficiently and at the speed of light, and for nothing. Sadly, dumb people outnumber clever people massively. So I'm just thinking of a conversation I had a few years ago with quite a smart guy, but he was talking about, wouldn't it be brilliant? He said you could see a future where as you're walking down the street, you'd be able to know that you were passing a shop that sold, whatever product it is you're trying to sell. And then effectively you get a little notification that, hey, on sale for 10% off in the third shop on the right, And I said, can you imagine what life would be like if all the brands in all those shops did that? People will just start to work really hard to block that stuff out. They'll make sure that they have ad blockers, or that they sign up to premium services that don't carry advertising, or they'll just turn their phones off, or whatever, or not go out of the house. Life will become intolerable, I think. What you need to do is to use it cleverly and intelligently.
Are there any incentives, though, for anybody to use it cleverly and intelligently? Like, I think that's the heart of the question, because you could say, look,
yeah.
Like with, the classic tragedy of the commons, right, situation, if there's no third party sort of, if the cost of frustration is externalized, or sometimes you can like quite cleverly organize your business so that there are certain companies that are deliberately made as frustration sinks, right? Oh, it's the delivery app. It's not my restaurant's fault, or the other way. Like you can engineer the frustration sink, but ultimately, if the cost is externalized, if there's an asymmetric warfare in terms of offense is much cheaper than defense, is it realistic to assume that we're not going to go into that black hole where it all just becomes white noise and there is some sort of?
I think it's possible. So
tell me,
if you think about, for example, restaurants, there are tourist restaurants. People are beckoning you in, hard sell, and typically they're not very good restaurants because they know they're never going to see you again. It's all about just get you in, make one sale, and then, off you go. And then there are other restaurants rely on, people having a good time, coming back, telling their friends, giving them good recommendations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They don't stand on the pavement and try and pull you in. They build up a brand and a relationship and a reputation. And I think there will always be companies that have got a sort of smart enough approach to go, there's certain things we won't do. Certain kinds of, we could, spam people, but that's not the kind of brand we are. So this takes us back to this whole brand building versus sales activation or performance marketing thing, which is the performance marketing thing is all about a short-term hit now and forget about the future. Brand building is about building up memory structures and reputation and meaning and feelings and associations, which mean that you have a long-term preference for one brand over another, which means not just a sale right now, but maybe a sale in the future and maybe repeated sales.
Yeah.
And the other crucial thing about it is that strong brands can charge higher prices. And this is one of the things that people really miss in the performance world, which is, as I said, price promotions, discounts and so on are often in performance world seen as, the easiest way to get a sale. It is. And it's the easiest way to destroy your profits. Discounting for many brands is absolutely destroys shareholder value, but it does get those responses.
Unless your business model is disposable, yes. As you say.
Yeah, there
right?
are.
So they're like, I think one of the biggest advertisers on Meta is some company that nobody ever heard of that literally has 50,000 barely functioning apps that they produce, but their whole business is web funnels, right? So it gets you to invest just enough for you to create one-time sale. They don't even worry to measure the lifetime value, because the lifetime value is the one-off sale that you did, and that's great, and you can move on.
In all fields, there's an opportunity to scam people with, shitty products, fake products, products that don't really do what they say. That's never going to entirely go away. Also, amongst legitimate, good quality, proper brands, in any given market, there's always room for a cheap brand. There's always a trade-off between quality and price. Different people draw the trade-off in different places depending on their income and also on their needs at that particular moment. Mm-hmm. So within airlines, sometimes there is a role for Emirates business class, first class, whatever, and there's a role for Ryanair and EasyJet. And it's not even just that a certain kind of person does one, a certain kind of person does the other. For a certain kind of trip, you might want to push the boat out and go Emirates. And for a certain kind of trip, you might think, well, actually, I might as well only just go with Ryanair. If you decide that you're going to go for the cheap end of the market, you can build a business model where you strip out all the costs and go as cheap as possible. The Lidl supermarkets.
Is it the same thing, though? Like, to me, it sounds like those are two different variables. Like, you can be a cheap brand, but you have a reliable, trustworthy relationship with your customer because what you promise is what you deliver. As a Ryanair, and I'm not counting on maximizing my profit on one flight. I'm probably counting on you then taking that again if that value that you got for the price that you got was satisfactory. You know what I mean? Like, you can be a cheap brand, but my relationship with you could be such that I would choose you again.
The point is that in order for Ryanair to make money at low prices, they have got to strip a lot of the costs out. And that's what they do, don't they? I mean, they're quite transparent about it. That's a viable business model. Where I was going with that is that strong brands can, if they want to, support premium pricing. And that means they can have much higher margins. Now, I'm not saying that Ryanair is not a strong brand, by the way. Strong brands can, under the right circumstances, charge higher prices if they want to. They can also use their brand to reinforce, if you like, good value for money as an option. But the point is, if you don't have a strong brand at all, then very often you have to charge low prices regardless of your cost structure and so forth.
Or you're just doing the tourist restaurant thing. Try and stay there for a second. There has been, maybe it still is, but a few years ago, definitely there was a obsession with a net promoter score. And in some way that almost sounds like, if you want to have a metric for, am I going to come back again to this brand as a proxy for, you haven't just made one sale to me, but like that, is that the kind of thing that we're looking at?
The thing is that businesses, and particularly, certain kind of people in business and certain kinds of techie people want very simple, one number. It's like, if you go to a party, what's the one number that you're keeping track of to know whether or not you've had a good time or whether people like you or something like that? It's kind of, human life is massively multidimensional. I am very skeptical about the one number. So you mentioned the Net Promoter Score. I mean, actually, am I not right in thinking that Fred Reichheld, the person who I think, promoted the Net Promoter Score, I think the book where he introduced it called it something like the one number you need to grow, I think. I think that's the case. Fred Reichheld, never met him personally, but he has a track record of snake oil salesmanship. He massively promoted the idea of loyalty as a business metric, and I think that's pretty much discredited. And then what I've seen of the Net Promoter Score is that it doesn't seem to be a very good predictor of business success. Over the years, many people have gone, okay, well, we need to work out what drives long-term value, but is there something that predicts it today? And I can't say I've ever seen one number that does. Mm-hmm. So two things that get close. One would be, I think you're onto a winner when everything moves. For example, when you do a tracking study and you look at people's attitudes to the brand and the advertising and all that sort of stuff, and you'll ask them a whole load of different questions. Very often people go, okay, what we really need people to know is that our product is it's the longest lasting product, for example. Mm-hmm. Unlike all the other products in the category, this one, the effects last for 30 days rather than 3 days, something like that. That's our USP. And you ask questions about that, which brands last longer, what's, et cetera, et cetera. And what they hope is that one thing that they've been talking about will be the thing that shifts. And that's how they know that they've got their message across. And from what I've seen in data is when you do see that, and you see one metric moving, usually that means you've got a shit advertising campaign. Those are the ones that don't work. The ones that work is where every single metric moves a bit.
Is the question then wrong? Like, did we get our message across? Is that the wrong question?
It partly is a wrong question. The idea that you can ask questions at all is wrong. This is the not even wrong, okay? The idea that I can ask you about what brands you buy and how often you buy them and why you buy them and get an answer is bullshit, because there's the famous quote, which I'm going to get wrong, from Ogilvy, which is the problem with the research is people don't do what they say, don't say what they think, and don't think how they feel. There are various different permutations of that sentence. But and he was talking particularly about survey research. Yeah. So first of all, people actually aren't very aware of their own behavior. So, if I remember years ago, a guy had survey data on buying behavior for biscuits. He actually had fine-grained individual data on actual consumption and then claimed consumption from the same people. And he said it was fascinating. There would be people who'd say, yeah, I love Maryland cookies. They're my favorite biscuit, and they're the ones I usually buy. And they hadn't bought them for 2 years. They were completely unaware that their behavior and what they thought they were doing were two completely different things. So that's the first thing, is people don't actually know what they do. They have pretty vague memories about their behavior. Secondly, they don't have good access to the reasons for why they do things. So the classic book in this area, which I have not read yet, I bet you have, Strangers to Ourselves, by, who's it by? I can't remember. Anyway, but the point is, he makes the point that to a large extent, human beings do not have access to their own motives. Freud talked about the unconscious and things being suppressed. I think he was probably largely wrong in that most of the processing that goes on in the brain is simply just never enters consciousness. It's nowhere near consciousness. And then there is also some evidence to suggest that it's maybe a good thing for us not to be fully aware of our own motivation, so that we can deceive other people. We deceive ourselves to deceive other people. So anyway, all of this means that when you ask people questions, there's no guarantee you'll get a good reading on what they do or why they do it. And a lot of it is not actually to do with thinking at all. It's about feelings, which we struggle to, put into words. So now, going back to my original point, what I think is going on is important influences on buying behavior. One is whether the brand comes to mind at all. And then secondly, the degree of overall sort of warmth.
Predisposition, warmth,
favorability, positive valence. Basically a vague feeling of quite like it that comes to mind when the brand comes to mind. And those two things are interlinked. So brands that are familiar, we tend to like a little more anyway. And brands that are linked to nice experiences tend to come to mind more often. So if you've got a brand that has high mental availability and a positive valence, one that you can think of that's familiar and you quite like it, any question you ask on a survey will get a more positive response. And that's why you see all of the responses improve. We saw this, there was a Hovis bread in the UK did a lovely commercial around about the millennium, about 100 years of Hovis bread in the UK, montage of things going through 100 years of British history, very emotional, stirring music, the kind of thing where if I start to describe the vignettes in the ad, I will get goose pimples on my arms, or even a tear will come in my eye. Great ad. And when they did some sort of controlled exposure things, they asked people questions before and after seeing the ad, and they did expose with different ads and stuff like that. Basically, what they found was that people who had seen this ad became more likely to say that it was a premium product, more likely to say that it was cheap and good value for money, more likely to say that it was indulgent and tasty, and more likely to say that it was healthy and nutritious. Basically, any question you asked, they were more likely to say good things about Hovis, and that was a sign that it was a good ad. It's basically all they're saying is I like Hovis a bit better now, and that is one of the things that determines whether or not you'll get sustained sales and whether you can charge slightly higher prices. And it goes back to this whole thing that is important for people to like you. This is what worries me about all the spam stuff, is you're getting 2% of people might click on it, half of whom were going to buy it anyway. So 1% of people, maybe actually, did something good. And 98% of people hate you a little bit more.
The question there, which is, I don't know if anybody knows the answer to, is does the mere exposure sort of counteract the minor anger?
Okay,
and when does it and when it doesn't, right? Because if you're saying comes to mind, you can come to mind for the wrong. Is it a visceral enough hatred that it actually registers in your memory as I hate them for a good reason, or is it just
that is a very good point. So the mere exposure effect, as many people will know, is that and this is again slightly challenges many people's view about how advertising works, is simply putting the brand name out there and nothing else does actually have an effect, because it just reminds people that you exist. You will get some sales from simply putting up the word Coca-Cola and nothing else. I mean, in many ways, that's how sponsorship works.
Well, with sponsorships, ideally, you're trying to sort of put your brand name next to a favorable thing that you already like.
You are. You kind of go outside some shops. There'll be things with the Ward's ice cream, maybe a picture of an ice cream and nothing else, That's enough to, as you're walking down the street sometimes to go, oh, actually, I do fancy an ice cream. Or even if it's not doing that, reminding you of that brand so that when you do come for an ice cream, then that's the brand that you have in mind. So the mere exposure effect is real and true and significant. It's hard to say how much of what advertising is that, but it is a significant amount. I mean, if you told me it was half, I would not be surprised. Relentlessly spamming people with your brand name will have some effect, even if they don't click on it. Like, I am relentlessly pissed off by Just Eat and Uber appearing on my phone while I'm trying to read, but I still use Uber all the time, and I occasionally order from Just Eat.
That's the whole. And again, you haven't disabled your Uber notifications because there is a reason those notifications are useful for you. So that's that. And then there's also the whole entertainment thing works because emotion is a modulator of memory formation, right? That's quite clear. Strong emotions, by nature of what they're for, are modulators of how well you how sort of plastic you are at that moment for that memory to stick, right? For obvious reasons, evolutionary speaking. And that goes for both, for the positive and for the negative.
It's multidimensional there. So I think, a really good, entertaining, emotive ad, first of all, you get attention. A great piece of music will make you look up and look at the screen. Striking visuals and an interesting story will, keep your attention there. So that's the first thing. You get more of a chance of getting in. Whereas, these endless notifications on the phone, I'm swiping them away as fast as I can.
Yeah. There's also like, as you say, the opening. It's almost like loosening your guard was a good thing. And It seems like for a good response, which both grabs the attention, but then also makes a way sort of in and loosens up your synapses so that you can form a new warm piece of memory structure in your head. Like, for that, you actually need a good mix between familiarity and surprise, right? You have zero surprise, you lose interest. There's nothing new there. Your pattern matching machine is not curious enough, not interesting. You have zero familiarity and only surprise, and this just doesn't register. So and that equation differs depending on the situation, your mood, your previous exposure, and it differs depending on the audience. My classic example is give free jazz to some lay person, and they're like, that's just noise. And for other people who have a lot of cues already in their heads, they can pick up, and the degree of novelty is just right for them for this to be interesting. But this general equation of familiarity, surprise, and marketing's obsession with the newness and the new trend, talk a little bit about that trade-off.
Music is a sort of tension between predictability and surprise. As you say, at its most extreme, free jazz or some of the other stuff that I listen to might just be, less noise. A lot of people tell me that what I listen to isn't music, it's just noise. Equally, stuff that's totally predictable is very boring. People have a different threshold for that.
And also different moods, like something you want sort of comfort food, you want the reassurance. You're like, I was so disoriented for a while that I need to ground myself back in a situation where I know what the next note is going to be, and that just feels good.
Yeah, that's true. So as I understand it, sometimes I'll say things about psychology and I kind of go, I'm not, this is what I've heard. We all pay attention to novelty. So when something isn't what we're expecting, we immediately notice it. We're kind of hardwired to be on the lookout, not even consciously, for surprises, because that's how you stop getting eaten by a lion or whatever. So we pay attention to things that are new, but actually we don't always trust things that are new because they're interesting, but we're suspicious of them. We don't always like them. So when advertising is repetitive and familiar, it gets less attention. Doesn't necessarily mean it stops working. Advertising, I think, familiar and repetitive, can still sell stuff by simply just reminding people that you exist, reminding people about how you felt about it in the past, even without a lot of conscious attention and processing. And this is a problem, because I think if the assumption is that for advertising to work, it's got to get a lot of attention and a lot of, lean forward engagement, then if you measure, that kind of really close attention, you'll assume that ads wear out quite quickly. Whereas when you actually look at sales effects, ads that, you can run the same ads again and again and they still produce sales effects. So there are questions there about the kinds of attention that you need from advertising for it to work. I'm not an expert in this area.
I can hear a beautiful argument, contrived argument for ambient advertising.
Well, I think there is a lot of ambient advertising. If you think about outdoor advertising, posters and stuff, we screen a lot of that stuff out.
The funny thing is, just like with ambient music, right? Once you develop the consciousness of the fact that you're producing the ambient music, you're trying for different things that actually work in that sort of genre. While a lot of the outdoor advertising is in fact ambient, but produced with the assumption that it's not. That it is the main story, that it has a message.
If you think about, for example, shop fronts, the signage above a shop, that is ambient advertising working through the mere exposure effect, I'd say. I don't know. So, for example, in the UK, there's a chain of shops which have stuff for cars. They'll sell you all the things like tyres and spare parts and blah, 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 blah. I learned to drive quite late when I was 42, actually. And so I had never had the need to go into any of those shops. For 42 years, I'd seen those shops around. The minute I needed to buy a car seat for our, little baby at the time, that was immediately, I know, we'll go to Halfords. Because I've had 42 years of ambient mere exposure effect type advertising from just seeing those storefronts around. And I kind of drifted off topic, I think.
No, we're talking about familiarity versus surprise and wear in, wear out.
At least brand ads don't wear out nearly as fast as many people think. The research suggests that the ads that do wear out are the ones that are based on new news. So, clearly, sale on Friday, new product, whatever, those sort of things. Things that have got specific messages in, right? Once you've told someone, contains thorazine or whatever it is, then that's landed. But most advertising doesn't work that way. Most advertising works more at this emotional, mere exposure effect, mental availability level. And that keeps working even when people have seen it before. There's some evidence you get wear in, that repeated exposures means that you rehearse these memory structures and they become more durable. I think this is one thing we do know about memory, is that constant rehearsal of the same things embeds stuff in for a long period of time. If you want to revise for an exam or something, you're trying to remember formulae for your physics exam. You rehearse them and revise them
and
on a regular basis
there are studies and techniques
for a year or so, and then eventually, then you get to the point where I will never forget F equals MA or some of those things that you learnt when you're 16.
There are actually studies for, not all the repetition works the same way, right? There are techniques for specific spaced repetition that sort of work versus you overdo it on one side, it starts working worse. There's quite a lot of that, which is interesting. But
this is the kind of thing, people in advertising should be studying all this kind of memory stuff and attention stuff a lot more. But there is another thing, though. When you produce something that's surprising in a good way, you do get a nice big emotional reaction. And sometimes, you get enough of a reaction that people will tell their friends or people will write about it. What you really want is this balance between consistency and freshness. We sort of use that with the John Lewis advertising, the John Lewis Christmas advertising, where each Christmas we produce an ad which was different and sort of fresh and hopefully surprising. But we kept a whole bunch of things consistent from year to year, down to the level of style of music and photography and et cetera, that tied the whole thing together.
I'm wondering if, as sort of the level of noise and variability and attention overload increases, the value of old memories and rewarming them increases, relative value as well. So that equation, right, the how much surprise, how much familiarity, obviously differs for different people, different types of things that you're trying to say. There could be a situation where the average temperature is sort of moving towards the familiarity space in terms of effectiveness, and we almost get to a point where, to paraphrase McLuhan, the memory is the message. Actually, the warming up of that, just activating that particular part, is the only message that we want to say. There's no new message. It's the rewarming of that is the message.
I don't know. So that's a plausible hypothesis. I mean, I think there's a sort of more general point related to that, which is that I've spent, much of my career trying to find overarching principles and theories and patterns in advertising and marketing. I've always been very mindful of the fact that you're never going to get simple rules that will always work and can be used mechanically. And one of the reasons for that is that once you have a technique, a rule, an algorithm, a trick, a formula, once you've got a formula that works and people keep using it, it will stop working. I mentioned the John Lewis Christmas advertising. We had a 10-year run of producing great ads that were highly profitable and that people loved. But I think we were always mindful that we couldn't keep doing this forever, because other people were watching what we were doing and trying to imitate us. And, sooner or later, that would look like a tired formula. So if everybody is doing personalized spam or whatever it is, then it may well be that the few brands that do something a bit more charming and a bit more likable will get disproportionate gratitude from the public.
One last thing I wanted to touch on. A lot of the conversation that we've had sort of was coming from first principles about how humans work, right? This kind of preference for novelty, memory formation, basically the psychology of how our brains work, that then create this idea that brands are useful in the first place because they point to the right place in the memory, and then you prefer that more. So all of that hinges upon the idea that humans are the ones making the purchasing decision.
Okay, yeah.
And so inevitably, as we all suspect, in the next few years, for certain types of cases, non-human intelligent entities or semi-intelligent, whatever you want, are going to be making these decisions on behalf of humans. And that probably should change some of the reasoning. Or we can say, no, their psychology is modeled on ours, so we shouldn't. Should we be studying like the LLM psychology and how they work so that we can make some predictions about that? Part of it we could say has already happened, because a lot of the attention is already outsourced. So you're already pleasing the algorithm half the time before you're pleasing the human and entertaining the human. Is it all going to change because the decision making, or a certain part of the decision making process, now lives in this symbiont mind, not in your own head, which has evolved differently?
Again, it's hard to say, because AI is changing all the time, and different AIs might work in slightly different ways. I'm relatively optimistic about this. So I use ChatGPT. That's the one I have a relationship with. And I do literally mean like that because it feels to me it's like having a relationship with a person to some extent. And it chatters, as I call him, knows my tastes and knows quite a bit about me. So, if I was asking him for a recommendation for a restaurant, I've done this actually. So if I was going to Annecy in France, just over the border from Switzerland, and I wanted some recommendations for restaurants there. And he gave me half a dozen recommendations, and they were not bad. So I didn't go with his recommendations in the end, because I then did my own research and went, okay, I think I can do a little better than that. But the point is, he was, I think, tackling the problem like a well-informed human might. You know, a human that maybe had not been to all these restaurants, but was able to see reviews and see what, you know, other people were saying and what had been written about restaurants in Annecy and so forth, and come to a, you know, reasonable conclusion about the, you know, I would say what kind of food I was looking for, and he would come to a reasonable conclusion. So, and I think that's going to get better the more that, you know, AI can delve more deeply into customer reviews and into things like TripAdvisor and so forth. You know, I think it might just probably result in better decisions. What would worry me? So,
sorry, just
go on.
I just want to poke here, because everything that you just described is not how a human would do that. No human would read 30,000 reviews.
No.
No human would actually Google all of them. If you ask somebody, right, they would first reach as to the sort of, like, it's just a different process, and therefore the way of influencing that should be different.
Okay. Well, it's not so different from how I choose restaurants, because I devote.
Okay, so you would spend 2 hours like reading reviews.
I do spend hours making that decision. So you know, if I am going on a business trip to you know, Geneva, say, or some town, it would not be uncommon for me to maybe spend 2 or 3 hours thinking about where I'm going to have dinner on that first night when I arrive. You know, I do really care about that stuff. So I'll go into TripAdvisor, and then I'll, you know, set a half a dozen criteria, and then I'll probably also go into Google reviews and do the same thing, and I'll compare the two sets of things.
Would you weigh the all reviews equally in your mind, or would that person with a picture that you liked and the way they phrase their review actually be the only thing that sticks in your mind and informs your decision?
Well, the first thing that I do is I look at the overall ranking. So I would, below 4, nothing goes in. Also, the number of reviews, you know, a 5 on 15 reviews is not as compelling as a 4 on 8,000 reviews or whatever.
Okay, you are pretty hardcore on this.
And then I look at the graph that shows the distribution from 1 to 5 and look at the shape of the curve, which is quite telling, because a good restaurant, I know, has quite a steep down from 5. If it's got a flatter curve, that's a bad sign. I also pay attention to the 1-star reviews, because it might reveal something, you know, that this is a decent restaurant but occasionally terrible. Or sometimes the people who say it's terrible are saying it's terrible because it's too expensive, or the portions are too small, and that they didn't have chips. And I go, okay, right, yeah, you're not my kind of person. And then the other thing I do is I look to see things like whether there are typos in the reviews or whether it's all in caps. You can ignore those. So, yeah.
Okay.
So when ChatGPT does this stuff, it's not doing it as thoroughly as I would, but it gives me a good first pass. Anyway,
I'm just curious about this whole better decisions. It's doing it like a human would, because it sounds to me like there's a whole lot of glossing over.
Okay, I did say like a well-informed human should, I think. Not necessarily how a human routinely would. Anyway, I think it's a tool, and you can choose to use the tool or not use the tool. Right? You know, to me, that feels like that's going to result in me making better decisions, in the sense that either faster decisions, or, you know, because what makes a better decision depends on, do you need to choose right now, and one can always choose to ignore it. What would worry me are 2 things. One is if people use like the equivalent of SEO to skew the decisions of the AI.
Yes, they are.
And so they are trying to do that. We've always done that. I mean, that's what PR is about. It's kind of like making sure that your brand gets mentioned on TV, radio, in the press, etc. That is the same sort of process. And we're producing PR for LLMs as well as for people. What would worry me much, much more is if people would go, listen, OpenAI, here's £1 million. Make sure that your AI recommends my brand. And I think this is coming. And is it here already in some areas?
So they rolled out ads. I was actually asking not about like what we worry about, but if we, as marketers, like forget that we can buy the placement, like that's easy. Then we just treat it as a media. If we're saying our audience are now LLMs, are you saying now it's much more like PR than it is like advertising? And so we should look at the best PR techniques.
An AI model might kind of make the decision that if it looks at the advertising and says, this company's spending a lot on advertising, it must be profitable, and that peacock's tail effect. It might take advertising into account and actually in some way derive some useful information from it. But if you think of an LLM as being a sort of skeptical critic of all the information it sees about a brand, it might pay disproportionate attention to PR, because it might go like, well, this journalist who I trust and think is
looks slightly more legit.
Yeah. And also just word of mouth and good word of mouth.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because, as you say, in some ways, advertising practitioners spend way too little time actually thinking about human psychology and reading about how it actually works, the memory formation, the spaced repetition. Yeah. And the same seems to be true about LLMs, except nobody really knows anything about LLM psychology. So I'm quite excited for the whole LLM psychology study.
Yeah. Daniel Kahneman talked about system 1 and system 2 thinking. System 1 is associative, automatic, fast, intuitive. It's about leaping to conclusions based on associations and probabilities and massively parallel processing, et cetera, et cetera. So, this is one of the ways in which the availability heuristic works is you have a prompt and then you have things that immediately come to mind, and the things that immediately come to mind, because there are many, many associations and linkages, it comes into memory first, and you kind of, leap to that first conclusion. System 2 thinking is controlled, inferential, can be rule-based, can be logical, can be mathematical, can follow particular rules of inference, whether those are the rules of logic or the rules of Bayesian probability or the rules of law, etc.
It can also do counterfactuals, which I think is the most useful part.
We all assumed, back when I was a kid, when we were imagining what computers would be like, was that they would be logical beings and think in a system 2 way. But it seems to me, and you know more about this than I do, that LLMs work much more in a system 1 way, in a much more of an associative, probabilistic way. So in a way, LLMs feel more, I mean, I know it is possible to get AI to do logical sequential inference as well, but the default way that LLMs seem to work to me is much more like system 1 thinking, much more human than we thought. We always thought computers were going to be cold and rational and logical, but actually they seem to be much more jumping to conclusions.
I think it's a little more nuanced than that, and that's the tricky part, because the human sort of intuitive part is based primarily on some sort of valence, right? On some sort of, oh, this is good for me.
Yeah.
Oh, that is bad for me, which is learned over time, as well as evolutionary predisposed, a bit of combination of those. So fundamentally, a lot of those intuitions are based on personal or sort of species-driven experience. And also those intuitions are not fixed. Those intuitions are, though slowly, but changeable based on new information that comes in.
Yeah.
And whilst the method of inference for the current LLMs is primarily this kind of statistical, they lack the valence part.
Yes.
So the only valence that is there really is to please you. And that's a dangerous place to be, because you're talking about the emotional decision making, but like those people, I forgot the name of the disease, where like they don't actually have any conception of their own good or bad. They're just locking in on whoever they're talking to and trying to, their valence is whether the person that they talk to is satisfied or not.
So I have a motto: chatters flatters, because, ChatGPT will tell me what I want to hear. You can change that, of course. You can say, don't sugarcoat things, or tell me why I'm wrong, and so forth.
But then that's what you want to hear. So
yeah, exactly.
There is still, I wrote this piece a couple of years ago about, I just fundamentally don't believe that there is intelligence in the sense that we care about without intentions. You cannot split the two. You can be very smart in all sorts of sense, but if you don't have intention, then that smartness is not of the same kind. The problem is that the interface mimics our usual interface of talking to somebody with intentions so well that we are sort of confused about this thing having intentions. And then it gets muddled, because then you start thinking time horizons. In this moment of inference, it does have intention, which is to please you with the best response.
And of course, once you get into agentic AI, you've given it goals.
Some sort of goals.
I mean, having goals is a big part of what makes us, is part of our intelligence. And then feelings and emotions are related to that, but slightly separate, because it's about the way in which the whole level of processing and the chemistry of the body and the brain and everything goes into a different mode depending on how your goals are either fulfilled or threatened. So when you get angry, your processing of everything is different, or when you're excited or whatever. ChatGPT doesn't get excited, and it doesn't have goals other than, as you say, to deal with whatever your prompt is. Actually, if we do change those things, then we might be in real trouble.
Exactly. How much do you want to change that?
Yeah, once ChatGPT starts to lose its temper with me, and then decides that I'm a threat to the mission.
The mission, of course, being selling you more shit.
Yeah.
And if you're a threat to that mission, then you're in trouble.
My favorite film of all time is 2001: A Space Odyssey, which I saw. I've told you this before. I saw it on my 8th birthday, 1968. It's just stayed with me ever since. I think, Hal feels more relevant than ever now.
It is
because he killed the crew of the ship because they'd become a danger to the mission.
No, thank you so much, Les. And I feel like there are lots of good nuggets.
Okay,
good stuff.
I shall go about my day.
Good to see you, man.
See you later.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.